The wind drove the snow sideways across the churchyard, stinging like a whip against the preacher's face as he fought to push the chapel door closed behind him, the creak of its hinges lost beneath the howl of the blizzard. He had been banking the stove for the night when he first heard it. Faint at first. Then again, a dull, frantic knocking, not on wood, but against the iron gate at the edge of the yard. Lantern in hand, he trudged into the storm, each step sinking deep into the drifts, until the light caught a shape half buried in white. She was slumped against the gate, her fingers curled tight around the bars, her thin dress soaked through and stiff with ice, the shawl around her shoulders no match for the bitter cold. Her hair clung to her cheeks in frozen strands, her lips blue, but her eyes still held a fierce, desperate light as they found his. "Please, don't," she whispered as he bent to lift her. "Don't lift my dress." The words struck him odd, half plea, half command, but there was no time to argue. He pulled her into his arms, feeling the unnatural weight of her skirts, and carried her through the storm to the chapel, the heat from the stove licking at their faces as he kicked the door shut behind them. He set her gently in the pew nearest the fire, her body trembling violently as the warmth began to creep back into her limbs. He fetched a blanket, draping it over her, but as he knelt to check her legs for frostbite, her hand shot out to grip his wrist. "Please," she said again, the same desperate edge in her voice. "Don't lift it. You can't." He frowned, torn between her plea and his duty to keep her alive. But something in the way her eyes darted toward the door made him pause. "There's something under there," he said quietly, and she looked away, the muscles in her jaw tightening. The wind rattled the shutters as he shifted, placing the lantern on the floor beside them. Slowly, he eased the edge of her skirt up just enough to see, and the sight made his breath catch. Strapped tight against her thigh beneath layers of damp fabric was a small bundle wrapped in oilskin and wool, the faintest whimper escaping as the blanket shifted. A newborn. He reached out, his hands trembling as he peeled back the corner of the wrap to reveal a tiny face, pale but warm, eyes squeezed shut against the light. "Dear God," he murmured, looking up at her. Her shoulders sagged, the fight in her posture melting into exhaustion. "They'll take him," she said, voice breaking. "If they find us, they'll take him away. I had to hide him." Outside, the wind carried another sound now, faint but distinct, the distant rhythm of hooves muffled by snow. She heard it too, her eyes locking on his. "They're coming," she whispered. In that moment, the preacher understood this was not a matter of simple shelter or charity. This was a siege waiting to happen, and the child he held was the reason men were willing to ride through a storm that could kill them all. He rose, setting the baby gently in her arms, and crossed to the door to throw the heavy iron bolt into place. "Then we keep him hidden," he said, his voice low and certain. "And we keep you both alive until this storm is done, no matter who comes looking." The knock didn't come like a polite summons. It slammed against the chapel door hard enough to make the lantern flame gutter and sway, the iron bolt groaning in its socket. The preacher stood in the center aisle, one hand still on the back of the pew, his ears full of the wind's roar and the pounding of his own heart. Outside, through the gaps in the shuttered windows, he caught flickers of lantern light moving against the swirl of snow, the shadows of men and horses shifting like wraiths on the churchyard wall. The widow, he could see that in her eyes now, the hollow grief of someone who'd buried a man, sat in the front pew with the bundle tight against her chest, her body angled protectively, the wolfskin blanket pulled high to hide the movement beneath. "Open up, preacher," a voice called, rough and slurred, the kind of tone that pretended at civility but carried threat beneath every word. We're looking for someone passed through here. Woman, dark hair, small, might have a child with her. The preacher's jaw tightened, and he glanced toward the stove where the fire popped and hissed. Ain't no visitors here, he called back, keeping his voice steady. Storms kept everyone in their own homes. A second voice joined the first, harder now. Don't play righteous with us. We saw her tracks lead straight to your gate. The widow's eyes were wide, her fingers gripping the bundle so tightly the oilskin crinkled. The preacher moved slowly to the door, placing himself so his shadow blocked the firelight from spilling onto her. You're not welcome in God's house armed and uninvited, he said, letting the steel edge into his tone. You want warmth? Leave your guns outside. For a moment there was only the hiss of the wind, then the sound of a fist slamming against the wood again. This ain't about warmth, preacher. It's about what's hers, what belongs to men who paid for it. The words landed like a stone in his gut, and without thinking he slid the rifle from where it rested by the doorframe, the wood worn smooth by years of his hands. God's house don't trade in people, he said, his voice lower now, and nothing in here belongs to you. He heard the scuff of boots retreating from the porch, then the muted murmur of voices beyond the wall. They weren't leaving. He could tell from the cadence. They were talking tactics, preparing. He stepped back toward the widow, speaking low so only she could hear. There's a side door at the back, opens into the alley behind the stables. If they force the front, you take the child and go. Head for the river. The wind'll cover your tracks. She shook her head, eyes bright with fear. You can't hold them alone. I'm not alone, he said, his gaze shifting toward the wolfskin rug, and for the first time she noticed the glint of two amber eyes just beyond the edge of the shadows. Watching. Waiting. The knock came, again, heavier, and then the sharp, splintering crack of wood under a boot heel. The preacher slid the bolt up just far enough to brace it with his shoulder and aimed the rifle toward the widening gap. The wind drove snow through the splinters in sharp, stinging flurries. Last chance, the voice outside snarled. The preacher's reply was quiet but carried in the stillness. You've already had it. The door shuddered under a final bone-rattling kick, the old wood groaning as the top hinge splintered, snow blasting into the chapel in a swirling wave. The preacher held his ground, shoulder braced against the failing door, the rifle wedged in the crook of his arm. Through the widening gap he saw the first man's face, pale from the cold, eyes glittering with malice, a scarf drawn up over his mouth. Behind him, shadowy figures loomed against the glow of their lanterns, the storm whirling around them like it was trying to shove them back. Move aside, preacher, the lead man snarled, leaning his weight into the wood. This ain't your fight. The preacher's jaw clenched. You came to God's house with threats. That makes it my fight. Another hard shove, and the door's bottom hinge tore loose, sending the preacher stumbling back just enough for the man to jam a boot inside. The widow gasped from the front pew, clutching the baby tighter beneath the wolf-skin blanket. Before the intruder could squeeze through, a low, savage growl rolled from the shadows by the stove. The wolf moved like smoke and lightning, launching from its crouch to slam into the man's leg. The scream that followed was sharp and raw, the man collapsing into the drift outside as the wolf's teeth sank deep. The preacher swung the door open just enough to level the rifle at the next figure pushing forward. The blast cracked through the storm, the muzzle flash lighting the snow in a blinding orange glare. The second man staggered back, clutching his shoulder, swearing as he dropped his weapon into the drifts. The others hesitated, their boots shifting nervously, the wind whipping their coats. "Get him!" the wounded one shouted, but none seemed eager to be the next through the doorway. The preacher stepped into the threshold, the wind clawing at his coat, the barrel of his rifle sweeping in a slow, steady arc. "You ride away now," he called over the roar of the storm, "and you'll see the morning. Stay, and you won't." The leader, still on the ground with the wolf's teeth locked around his shin, snarled in pain but waved the others back. "This ain't done, preacher," he spat. "We'll be back, and we'll take what's ours." The preacher didn't lower his aim. "You've got no claim here but the one you made in hell. Go join it." At his last words, the wolf released its grip, stepping back with a low rumble that vibrated in the frozen air. The men hauled their leader up, dragging him toward the flickering lantern light until the blizzard swallowed them whole. The preacher shut the door, dropping the heavy bolt back into place, the thud of it final and solid. Inside, the air was warm but taut with silence. The widow's eyes shone in the firelight, not with relief, but with the hard knowledge that what he'd said was true. They would be back. The preacher crouched to the wolf, running a hand over its thick fur, feeling the rapid thud of its heart. "You bought us time," he murmured, before glancing toward the woman. "Tomorrow we move. Tonight, you rest." Outside, the storm screamed across the plains, erasing tracks, but not the danger that had left them. At first light, the storm had softened to a quiet hush, the kind that blankets the land in silence but hides every danger beneath white. The preacher stood at the chapel's back door, his coat pulled tight, rifle slung across his shoulder, and his eyes scanning the alley that wound toward the tree line beyond town. The wolf paced beside him, pawing at the snow like it sensed urgency in every frozen gust. Behind them, the widow held her baby close beneath her cloak, the infant swaddled in warmth and silence, his face barely visible beneath folds of wool and oilskin. Her eyes met the preacher's, and without a word, he nodded. They slipped out into the morning stillness, the door creaking shut behind them. Every footstep was deliberate, each crunch in the snow like a thunderclap in the silence. The preacher led, his boots sinking into fresh powder, the widow just behind, the wolf weaving between them like a shadow. The chapel steeple disappeared behind them as they passed the rear of the blacksmith's shop and slipped into the narrow trail that ran behind the stables. The preacher paused and motioned for them to crouch. Hoofprints, 4 of them, led away from the main road. He touched them with gloved fingers. Fresh. The men hadn't left. They'd simply circled. The danger hadn't passed. The wolf growled low in its throat, nose in the air. "They're out there," the preacher whispered. "Watching, waiting." He turned to the widow. "We stay low. Don't speak unless I say." She nodded, her jaw clenched, not from cold, but from determination. The trail curved behind the cooper's barn, and ahead the woods began, pines thick with snow, trunks spaced close enough to conceal but tight enough to slow. The preacher moved first, stepping between trees, testing the snowpack for depth and ice. They were halfway through the grove when the shot rang out. It cracked like a whip through the morning air, hitting a tree just inches from the widow's shoulder. She dropped to her knees instinctively, covering the child. The preacher wheeled around, rifle raised, eyes scanning the ridge beyond the clearing. "There," he called, pointing to a flicker of movement, just a coat vanishing behind a trunk. Another shot followed, this one hitting a low branch above them, sending powder down like a curtain. "Run!" he shouted. "To the river!" The widow sprinted, her feet barely finding purchase in the drift, but she moved like instinct drove her, not fear. The preacher followed, firing once toward the ridge, the crack echoing through the trees. The wolf darted alongside them, growling, then veered off suddenly, cutting through the trees with purpose. The river came into view, a black ribbon through the snow, partially iced, with a narrow wooden bridge spanning it just 100 feet away. The widow reached it first, stumbling onto the planks, breath ragged. Then came a shout from behind. One of the riders had given chase, rifle raised. They found the trapper's cabin just after dusk, tucked deep into a ravine where the snow piled high, but the wind died low. The preacher had remembered it from years ago, built by a man who'd long since vanished, leaving behind a shack of rough-cut logs and a stone hearth that still held the ghost of warmth when he pried open the door. Inside, the air was musty but dry, and the chimney unblocked. He struck flint to tinder, coaxing a fire to life while the widow eased into a corner with the baby, her hands shaking more from memory than cold. The wolf circled once, then curled near the door, eyes fixed outward. They were safe, for now, but it would not last. When the light finally steadied and the shadows softened, the preacher turned toward her. "We've earned truth," he said. "Not cruelly, just steady. I'll keep the boy safe. I've bled for it. But I need to know why they'd ride into a blizzard to get him back." The woman's eyes didn't rise at first. She looked into the fire as though trying to find her answer there. "I wasn't supposed to live," she whispered. "Neither was he." The preacher said nothing, only watched her face. "My husband," she continued, "was a trapper. Good man. But he died months before the baby came. I tried to go home, but my father said I'd shamed them, that the child meant I'd been unfaithful. He married me off to a trader in a border camp to clear his debts." Her voice trembled now. "The trader didn't want a wife. He wanted control. He sold me like livestock to men who made their money in other people's misery. And when they found out I was pregnant, they beat me and left me in the snow, said the child would curse them all." The preacher's jaw clenched, a vein in his temple rising, but he said nothing. The widow finally met his eyes. "I was crawling when I found the trail that led to your church. I didn't even know where I was going, just knew I had to hide him. They said if I birthed a bastard, they'd bury it." Her arms wrapped tighter around the baby, her voice cracking. "They broke my ribs trying to force him out early. They wanted him gone." The fire popped, casting sudden sparks up the chimney. The preacher stood slowly, jaw tight, eyes wet but hard. "Then they'll have to bury me before they lay hands on him." She blinked, startled by the quiet fury in his voice. He stepped toward her, lowered himself beside her on the floor, and gently placed a hand on the baby's wrap. "This child wasn't born in shame," he said softly. "He was born in fire, and he'll grow in peace, even if it takes a war to buy it." The wolf's ears twitched, head lifting as if in silent agreement. Outside, the wind began to rise again, not as wild as before, but steady. The preacher reached into his satchel, unwrapped a cloth bundle, and placed it on the floor. Salt, dried meat, a flask. "We rest tonight," he said. "But come morning, we keep moving. They'll track blood. And they'll smell fear. We carry neither." The widow said nothing, but her eyes softened. The fire crackled, and for the first time in days, the cabin held something like safety. The morning came with a strange hush, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The preacher stepped out first, rifle in hand, boots crunching softly through the thick crust of snow. The widow and child stayed just behind the door, while the wolf moved low beside him, pausing now and then to sniff the air. The preacher knew this land better than most, but even so, something felt off, like the forest had eyes. And it did. He spotted the flicker of movement just before the glint of sun caught metal. Not a rifle, but a necklace, strung with bone and copper, worn by a man high in the pines, seated as still as the bark itself. The Lakota scout didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply tilted his head and studied the preacher with dark, unreadable eyes. The wolf stopped too, muscles tensing, but the preacher lifted a hand. "I remember you," he said softly, loud enough to carry. "You rode with Red Elk's band when they came through 2 winters ago." The man didn't move. The preacher lowered the rifle to his side. "We've got a woman and child in that cabin. They're being hunted." Silence stretched, and then the scout dropped lightly from the tree without a sound, landing in the snow like a shadow with legs. He approached slowly, nodding once toward the cabin. "You were the preacher who fed the starving child in Claw Ridge," the man said finally. His voice was low and deliberate. "You stood between him and your own people." The preacher gave a short nod. "Didn't seem like a choice at the time." The Lakota man's eyes flicked toward the wolf. "That animal is not just yours. He walks with spirits. That's why they haven't found you yet." The preacher followed his gaze, but didn't interrupt. "The men after you?" the scout asked. "How many?" "5, the preacher said. "Maybe more now. Armed. Desperate. They want the child." The scout's lips pressed into a line. "Then they'll follow the river bend south. It's the only pass open now. But I know another path. Higher. Colder. They won't expect it." The preacher hesitated. Trust was a rare thing in these hills, rarer still between white men and Lakota warriors. But the widow stepped out from the cabin then, the baby held close, and the way the scout's eyes softened said more than words. "She is brave," he said. "The kind of woman stories are made from." "She's done enough running," the preacher replied. "We're not looking for a hiding hole, just a way to make it to spring." The scout gave a single nod, then motioned for them to pack. "You'll follow me then. The child is not just hunted. He's cursed in the eyes of men who fear what they cannot control. They will burn the land to erase him." "Let them try," the preacher muttered. "We've got fire, too." Within an hour, they had left the cabin behind, climbing a narrow, snow-choked path that wound like a ghost through the cliffs. By the time they reached the ridgeline, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, casting everything below into that cold blue light that comes just before nightfall. The air grew thinner, sharper, and every breath burned like smoke in the chest. The Lakota scout motioned for silence as they approached a narrow rope bridge that stretched across a deep gorge carved by an icy, roaring river far below. It wasn't wide, just enough for one person at a time, and it swayed with every gust of mountain wind. The widow looked at it and clutched the baby tighter. "You'll go first," the preacher whispered to her. "The boy needs to be across before the sun drops." She nodded, lips pressed tight. The scout tested the ropes, then signaled it was safe. With careful steps, she crossed, wind tugging at her cloak. The baby didn't make a sound, just looked up at the sky like it knew the weight of the world sat in his mother's arms. The preacher watched every step until she reached the other side. Then the scout crossed behind her, fast and light. The preacher turned to the wolf. "You stay with them." But the wolf didn't move. It stayed by the preacher's leg, ears perked, eyes locked back down the trail they'd come. That's when they heard it, the crunch of boots over snow. At first, 1 pair, then 2, then more. "They're here," the preacher muttered. "Too soon." A figure emerged from the trees, rifle in hand. Then another. They fanned out quick, having learned from the ambush near the church. No shouting this time, just calm, slow steps and death in their eyes. "Preacher," the lead man called, voice low. "You hand over the boy now and we leave you breathing. That's more than you left Jethro." The preacher didn't answer. He looked once across the bridge. The scout had drawn his blade, standing beside the widow like a statue. The preacher looked to the wolf. "Go," he whispered, but the animal growled low, refused to leave. "Suit yourself," he muttered, then stepped into the open, raising his voice. "You want a child so badly? Come and take him from a man standing." The first shot rang out, grazing a tree beside his head. He dove behind a rock, firing once in return. Chaos erupted, shouts, movement, gunfire echoing off canyon walls. The wolf leapt at one man, flanking from the right, jaws locking on his arm, taking him down before he could scream. The preacher fired again, dropping the next man who dared rush him. But they kept coming. 3 still remained. One moved up the ridge to try for a shot down into the gorge. Another crawled left. The third, bigger, meaner, charged straight in. The preacher ran out of rounds. As the man closed in, he swung the rifle like a club, cracking it across the attacker's jaw. They tumbled in the snow, fists flying, boots kicking. The preacher landed a punch that drew blood, but the man reached for a knife. Then came a blur, brown and gray, launching from the orb, snowdrift. The wolf slammed into the attacker's back, sending him over the edge of the gorge. Silence. The preacher panted, blood on his coat, his hand shaking. One man left. He stood now at the start of the bridge, rifle pointed at the widow across the chasm. The preacher moved slowly, stepping toward the edge, hands raised. "You shoot her," he said, "and I swear I'll drag you to hell myself." The man sneered. "You think I won't?" But before his finger could twitch, an arrow flew from the trees, fast, silent, and true. It pierced his shoulder, sending him stumbling back. The Lakota scout stepped from the trees, bow drawn again. The preacher didn't hesitate. He ran to the bridge, calling, "We move now!" And as night fell over the gorge, they crossed into the dark with only the wind and the wolf at their backs. They reached the Lakota winter camp just before dawn, cloaked in the last breaths of darkness, where the pines grew thicker and the wind softened like it too, was tired of chasing. The scout led them down a hidden trail flanked by prayer stones and tobacco bundles, each one a whisper to the spirits. Smoke curled from the center of the encampment, not from fires of war, but from healing flames, slow and warm. The preacher helped the widow down from her horse, her legs weak, her eyes heavier than they'd ever been, and she cradled the baby tight to her chest like she feared even rest might steal him. The camp received them without question. No guns, no accusations. The old ones looked with quiet eyes, the young ones with curiosity. They recognized the scout, and that was enough. A medicine woman approached, her hair streaked with snow and age, and wordlessly placed her hand on the widow's arm. She guided her to a shelter made of hides and pine branches, where warmth waited. The preacher started to follow, but the scout held him back with a hand to the chest. "Let her rest. She is not your burden. She is the storm that survived." The preacher nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the hut where the woman and child disappeared into quiet. The scout led him to the edge of the camp, where a council fire burned low and coals whispered old truths. There, elders sat wrapped in furs, their faces carved from time. The scout spoke in Lakota, slow and steady, then turned to the preacher. "They know who hunts you, men of coin and pride, traders, slavers. They've paid riders to cross any border." "Even here?" the preacher asked, eyes narrowing. The scout nodded once. "Even sacred land means little to those who've never bled on it." A hush fell over them. The fire cracked. Then one of the elders spoke in a voice thin but sharp. "You carry a child that was meant to die but was born to change. That makes you part of our storm now." The preacher swallowed. "I didn't ask for this war." "No one ever does," the elder replied. But some men are made from war. Others are made for what comes after. Before the preacher could respond, a rider galloped into camp from the east trail. Breathless, horse lathered. He shouted something in Lakota. The scout turned pale, eyes narrowing. They've crossed the river. 6 riders, maybe more. They'll be here by midday. Then we fight, the preacher said, rising, but the scout shook his head. We move again. This place is not for bullets. It is for prayers. And if we don't make it to the next pass? The preacher asked. The scout looked toward the widow's shelter. Then we die between her and the child, not behind them. The preacher's jaw clenched. He turned to see the wolf waiting near the edge of the camp, eyes trained on the trail. Even the animal knew time was thinning. The preacher moved to the shelter, pushed aside the flap, and found her sitting up. Baby, asleep on her lap, eyes wide and knowing. We run again, he said softly. They're coming. She nodded once, no fear in her face, just tired, steady resolve. Then let's finish it this time, she said. And from behind her, the wolf growled low, not from fear but from readiness. The preacher lifted the sleeping child into his arms, looked to the horizon, and knew. If this land had ever seen a miracle, it was this. 3 souls stitched together by blood, fire, and the kind of love that didn't speak. It stood, teeth bared, between the innocent and death. The path they followed now was older than any map, carved not by men but by elk and storm and time. Snow fell soft and slow, a quiet warning from the sky itself. The Lakota scout moved ahead with the wolf, his steps sure, each one a prayer to ancestors who'd once walked this same ridge under moons of war. Behind him, the preacher rode with the child bundled close beneath his coat, the widow wrapped in furs behind him, arms around his waist, breath steady despite the cold. The mountain pass they climbed was known by one name among the people who feared it: where men go to die. Not for ghosts, but for the way the land turned against pursuers. Jagged cliffs, sudden snow shifts, and a single choke point where one man with enough fight could hold off 10. That's what the preacher was counting on. He'd spotted the place 2 days before, a narrow bend between 2 frozen ledges where snow piled high and rocks jutted out like ribs. As they reached it now, the scout slowed and turned. You know what this place means? The preacher asked. I do, the scout answered. You'll hold here? I will, the preacher said. The widow's hands tightened on his sides. No, she said, voice low but fierce. We all go, or none of us. The preacher turned, met her eyes. They want the boy, not you, not me. I stay, you run. He lives. The scout nodded. I'll take them through the frost route, a hidden way down the southern face, dangerous but fast. The preacher swung off the horse, handed the baby to the widow. Tell him stories of fire, he said, not fear. Tell him why wolves are holy. Tell him his life was paid for in full. Her eyes glistened but didn't fall apart. She only leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. You saved more than us, she whispered. You saved the part of me I thought they killed. The wolf whined low, nudged the preacher's leg, and then, without command, turned and padded after the scout and the widow. The preacher watched them go until they vanished into white. Then he turned, pulled his coat tighter, and began the work. He stacked stones for cover, scattered brush to hide his footprints, and settled behind the ridge with his rifle across his knees. And then he waited. The sun broke just enough to throw golden light across the snow when they came. 6 riders, furs stiff with cold, eyes narrow. They didn't call out this time. They came silent, weapons drawn, the kind of men who'd kill a child without blinking. The preacher let the first two pass beneath the ridge before he fired. One shot, then another. Both fell before they even screamed. The rest scattered, firing blindly toward the rocks. The preacher ducked, returned fire, moved position. Bullet scraped his shoulder, drew blood, but he stayed low, stayed breathing. One man tried to flank him. The preacher met him with the butt of his rifle, smashing teeth and bone, dropping him in the snow. Another charged, but the preacher drew his knife, short and brutal, steel meeting flesh. 3 left, then 2, then none. Silence. The snow was red. The preacher staggered, shoulder bleeding, breath ragged. He looked to the trail where the widow had gone, still untouched. Safe. He sank to one knee, chest heaving, then collapsed to his side, snow kissing his skin like farewell, and just as the edges of the world began to blur, he saw a shape rise from the drift. A wolf, eyes wild, fur soaked in blood not its own, pressing close to his side. Not alone. Not yet. The wind shifted at midday, and the scout knew before he saw her that something had changed. The wolf was gone. The silence in the trees was wrong, and the widow, who should have been headed for safety, had turned back. He saw her crest the snowy ridge like an omen, furs flapping behind her, baby slung tight to her chest, eyes burning with something fierce and unforgiving. "He's still alive," she said before the scout could speak. "I know it. I felt it." The scout tried to stop her. "You go back, you risk the child." "And if I don't," she said, "I bury more than a man. I bury the only part of me that still believes in mercy." She pressed the baby into his arms. "You take him. If the preacher's gone, he'll need a story. If he's breathing, he'll need me." Then she was running, through drifts waist-deep, breath sharp in her lungs, legs numb but moving. She followed the tracks, the blood, the memory of his voice telling her she was more than the men who broke her. And then she saw it. Bodies sprawled in the snow, their weapons cold in dead hands. The wolf stood guard beside a shape slumped at the rocks. The preacher. His coat was soaked, his arm bent wrong, but his chest still rose and fell like a slow prayer. "You stubborn fool," she whispered, dropping beside him, pulling his head into her lap. His eyes fluttered. "Thought I told you to run." "You did," she said, brushing hair from his brow. "But so did they, and I'm tired of men telling me to disappear." The wolf circled once, then sat beside them, its breath white against the sky. She tore strips from her cloak, bound his wound as best she could, then leaned close. "You're not dying in this place, not after all we lost to get here." He tried to smile. "You came back." "I never left," she said, and kissed his temple. Then, slowly, carefully, she pulled him upright. "On your feet, preacher. You're not a ghost yet." He groaned, staggered, but she held him, strong and steady. Step by step they moved toward the trail where the scout waited, the child cradled safe in his arms. When they reached him, the scout said nothing, just looked between them and nodded once. The preacher, barely upright, locked eyes with the baby. "Still breathing," he whispered. "Still worth it." That night they built a small fire beneath a shelter of pine. The scout sat watch while the widow lay beside the preacher, his hand tucked in hers. The baby slept between them, warm and safe. The wolf curled nearby, ears twitching at every sound, but no longer growling. Morning came slow and gold, casting long shadows over a camp not of warriors or fugitives, but of survivors. The preacher stirred, and for the first time in days, smiled without pain. The widow reached for his hand. "We made it." "No," he said softly. "You made me. I was just the man who finally followed something holy." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and, Together they looked out over the land. The war was not over. The world had not changed. But in that clearing, guarded by a wolf and lit by fire, a woman once broken, a child once unwanted, and a preacher once lost had built something the world could never take: a family.